Queen Ariana stood on the high tower and watched her world burn below her feet, and the smoke rose thick into the night sky. While her people screamed and ran from the fire that consumed their homes, and she felt her heart break with every sound. A pain that reached her ears, but she could not cry, because queens do not cry in front of their subjects, even when everything they built for 300 years falls apart around them. Beside her stood Nethys, the great black dragon who had been her companion since she was a small child, learning to walk in these very halls in his wings, spread wide enough to block out both moons that hung in the sky and his scales reflected the firelight like dark mirrors, and when he breathed, the air itself trembled with ancient power that had protected this kingdom for 10,000 years. The humans had arrived 3 months ago in ships that tore holes in the fabric of space itself, and they brought weapons that Ariana had never seen before, and could not understand because they did not use magic or steel but something else. Entirely that bent reality and unmade matter, with cold precision that left no bodies behind, just empty space. Where her soldiers had stood moments before, Commander Lisa Hart led the human forces, and Ariana had studied every report about this woman who had conquered 17 worlds before coming to the Thornwood realm, and the reports said she was brilliant and ruthless and desperate because her people came from a world called Earth that had died when their sun expanded too early and consumed their home in fire and radiation. Ariana tried to hate these invaders who'd killed her people and burned her cities, but when she looked at the human camps through her Farsean crystal, she saw children huddled around fires with faces too thin and eyes too old, and she saw parents holding babies and whispering promises they probably could not keep, and she saw soldiers who looked as tired and scared as her own warriors. Nethys rumbled deep in his chest, and the sound made the tower shake beneath them, and he said, "My queen, we must decide now whether we fight until the last elf falls, or whether we seek peace with these strange creatures who smell of metal and desperation." Ariana gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white, and she wanted to scream that there could be no peace with invaders who killed her people. But she also knew that her armies were losing and the humans had more ships arriving every week, and if this continued, there would be no elves left to rule and no kingdom left to save. She thought about her duty to her people and her oath to protect the Thornwood realm, and she thought about the weight of her crown that she had worn for 3 centuries without complaint, but now felt heavy enough to crush her. And she thought about Nethys, who had never failed her in all their years together, and she made her decision to arrange a meeting with their commander and tell her, "I wish to discuss terms, but keep your flames ready, old friend, because if this is a trap, I want them to burn before they can celebrate their victory." Far below in the human camp, a young woman named Claire sat in a small tent surrounded by elven communication crystals that she had spent weeks learning to understand, and she had discovered that she could hear the private conversations between Queen Ariana and her dragon, and also the secret meetings of the Elven High Council, who opposed any peace with humans. Claire had heard Ariana talk late at night when she thought no one listened, and the Queen spoke about the weight of leadership and the loneliness of living so long that everyone she had loved in her youth was dust and bones, and she spoke about wondering if her people had become too proud and too isolated, and if maybe the humans arriving was not just a disaster but also an opportunity. But Claire had also heard something else in the Queen's voice when Ariana spoke about Commander Hart, and it was a tone that Claire recognized from her own experiences of watching someone from across a crowded room and wondering what it would be like to know them better, and this worried Claire because she knew that feelings like that could complicate everything. The next morning, both armies gathered in a meadow that had not yet been touched by war, and the grass still grew green between the scorch marks, and wildflowers bloomed in colors that Earth had never known, and in the center stood a tent made of white fabric that both sides agreed would be neutral ground. Queen Ariana entered, wearing armor that shimmered with protective magic, and her silver hair was braided in the war style of her people, and her ancient sword hung at her side, and she moved with grace that came from centuries of practice, but her eyes showed the exhaustion of someone who had not slept well in months. Commander Lisa Hart stood waiting, and she wore combat gear that had seen better days, and her eyes glowed faintly blue from the cybernetic implants that let her see in multiple spectrums and process information faster than any unmodified human could, and she had scars on her face and hands from battles fought across 17 worlds. They stared at each other for a long moment, and neither spoke because both were trying to measure the other and decide if this meeting was genuine or just another move in the deadly game they had been playing. Lisa spoke first, and her voice was rough like someone who had breathed recycled air for too long, and she said, Your world is beautiful, Queen Ariana, and I wish we had met under different circumstances instead of over the bodies of our dead. Ariana felt something twist in her chest at those words because they were honest in a way that surprised her, and she replied, Wishes do not unburn my cities or bring back the lives you have taken. But up close, she could see that Lisa looked as tired as Ariana felt, and her cybernetic hand trembled just slightly. And this was not a conqueror drunk on power, but someone carrying impossible burdens. Lisa activated a device that showed images floating in the air, and Ariana watched in horror as a world died and continents cracked apart, and oceans boiled into steam, and billions of people tried to escape on ships that could not hold them all. And Lisa said 40 billion souls, and we saved 6 million, and the rest burned because we did not have enough ships or time or anything. Ariana had lived 300 years and seen empires rise and fall, but the raw grief in this human woman's eyes was something universal that crossed all boundaries of species and culture. And she said, So now you come to take our home, to save what remains of yours. Lisa shook her head and said, I come to beg for a chance at coexistence because we have technology you need, and we know the Void Reavers are gathering at your borders. And yes, we detected them, and in return, we ask for land in the southern wastes that your people abandoned centuries ago. Ariana knew this was both truth and lie, because the southern wastes were poisoned by ancient weapons from a civil war that her people tried to forget, and nothing could live. They're without technology to cleanse the corruption, and Lisa's intelligence was incomplete, but the human commander was offering something real. Before Ariana could answer, an explosion rocked the tent, and she heard screaming outside, and plasma fire lit up the walls, and someone had broken the truce. And in the chaos, Lisa threw herself forward and shielded Ariana with her own body as shots went over their heads. Lisa gasped, and blood spread across her side where metal had torn through her armor. And she said, Stupid, so stupid, I should have screened my people better. And Ariana felt her hands move on. Instinct and golden light poured from her fingers into the human's wounds. Around them both armies had frozen, watching their leaders, and Nethys descended from the sky like vengeance made flesh, and his roar split the heavens. But Ariana raised her hand and said, No more blood tonight, old friend. We have spilled too much already. As medics rushed forward from both sides, Ariana looked into Lisa's eyes and saw something that terrified her more than any weapon, because it was the possibility of understanding and connection, and something that could never be between a queen who had lived 3 centuries and a human who would live. Maybe one the southern wastes are cursed, Ariana whispered, but perhaps together we could heal them. And Lisa smiled through the blood on her lips and said, Perhaps we could. The shadows Claire watched everything, and her face showed worry because she had heard the queen's private thoughts through the crystals, and she knew that Ariana's feelings for the human commander ran deeper than diplomacy. If that truth came out before trust was built, it could destroy everything they were trying to create. The sky grew darker as storm clouds gathered, and in the distance, something howled with voices that should not exist in any sane universe, and both armies looked up with fear because the Void Reavers were coming and time was running out for everyone. 3 months passed, and the alliance between elves and humans grew stronger with each day. That brought them closer to the arrival of the Void Reavers, and human machines worked beside elven magic to cleanse the southern wastes of the ancient poisons that had made the land dead for so many centuries. Ariana found herself walking through the crystal gardens with Lisa more often than she should, and they talked about strategies for defending against the Reavers, but also about poetry and music, and what it meant to carry the weight of command when every decision might doom the people you were sworn to protect. Lisa told stories about Earth before it died, and about cities that reached into the clouds, and oceans that sparkled under a yellow sun, and about foods that would never be tasted again, because the recipes died with the world. And Ariana listened. It felt something warm growing in her chest that she had not felt in 2 100-year Nethys watched these walks with growing concern, because he could feel the change in his bonded queen, and her heartbeat quickened when Lisa entered her room and she touched the communication device Lisa had given her during quiet moments when she thought no one noticed, but dragons notice everything one. Evening, Nethys said to Ariana, "You play a dangerous game, my queen, because humans live such brief lives, and to open your heart to one is to guarantee grief when they fade in you." Remain, Ariana snapped back. "I have opened nothing," but her hand went to the device at her belt, and they both knew she was lying to herself, and Nethys sighed with smoke curling from his nostrils because he had never seen his queen vulnerable to anything except duty. In the human settlement, Lieutenant Kate Morrison spoke quietly with Commander Hart and said, "Ma'am, the crew is talking, and they see how you look at the Elven Queen, and they are." Scared, Lisa's cybernetic eyes dimmed as she processed this, and she asked, scared of what exactly. Kate hesitated, then said, "That when the Void Reavers come, you will choose to protect her kingdom instead of our people. And some are saying we should activate the Scorched Earth Protocol and take what we need and leave the elves to face the Reavers alone." The Scorched Earth Protocol was buried deep in the fleet archives, and it was a plan from Earth's final days that would deploy reality bombs to make a world uninhabitable, and then evacuate with whatever resources could be salvaged, and it had never been used because Earth's government had kept some morality even at the end. Les's voice went cold in the way that made admirals twice. Her age stepped carefully, and she said, "Tell me who is pushing for this, and tell them, if I hear about it again, I will space them myself." After Kate left, Lisa sat alone, staring at a hologram she had recorded of Ariana, laughing at some joke about human coffee, and the queen's silver hair caught the light in her ancient eyes. Looked almost happy, and Lisa whispered, "How could I be your wife when I am made of metal and desperation, and you are made of starlight and eternity?" Claire entered without knocking, because linguists had authorization codes that let them go almost anywhere, and she looked troubled and said, "Commander, we need to talk about what I have been hearing through the Elven communication network." What Claire revealed changed everything, because the Elven High Council had been secretly communicating with the Void Reavers, not to ally with them, but to negotiate a terrible bargain where the elves would seal their realm behind dimensional barriers and abandon the humans to the Reavers. In exchange for being left alone, the Council believed that the human presence was a beacon, drawing the Reavers to their world, and they were willing to sacrifice their queen's honor to save their civilization, and they planned to present this as done during the Festival of Renewal, while Ariana was distracted with ceremony. Lisa stood in military training ward with something softer and more dangerous in her chest, and she said, "I need to warn." Ariana. Claire shook her head and said, "You do then. You revealed that we have been spying on their private communications, and the alliance breaks, and your people are caught between the elves and the Reavers with no safe harbor, or you activate Scorched Earth and take what you need and run, and your people survive." Lisa said that would kill millions, and Claire replied that hesitating might kill the 6 million humans under your protection. In the palace, Nethys brought similar news to Ariana, because dragons have their own intelligence networks that stretch back 10,000 years, and he said that High Council moves to betray your oath and abandon the humans while you sleep. Ariana's fury made the air crackle with power, and she could execute the Council for treason. But that would start a civil war at the worst possible time. Or she could warn Lisa, but that would reveal how fractured her own government was and possibly destroy the human commander's fragile trust. "What would you have me do, old friend?" Ariana asked, and Nethys was quiet for a long time before saying, "I would have you be happy, my queen, because for the first time in 3 centuries I have seen you smile like you remember how, and the human commander looks at you the way dragons look at treasured hoards, but I am also sworn to protect our realm, and I do not know if those duties can coexist." Ariana's hand found the communication device, and one call to Lisa would warn her, but it would also mean choosing the human over her own people's safety and gambling that together they could find another way, and if she was wrong, both civilizations would pay the price. She whispered the words from the old poem, "How could I be your wife when my crown is woven from thorns and impossible?" Choices. 2 days remained until the Festival of Renewal, when the High Council would make their move and the Void Reavers would arrive, and 2 leaders would have to decide if trust was worth the risk of annihilation. What neither knew was that their quiet walks through the crystal gardens had been observed by something else entirely, and a Void Reaver scout had been watching and transmitting every word back to its masters, because the Reavers had learned long ago that the sweetest conquests came not through force, but through exploiting the divisions within their prey. The Rever Queen floated in the darkness between stars, and listened to the reports, and she laughed with a sound like dying suns, because she had seen this pattern 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds in love. Always made civilizations weak, she sent orders to her swarms, and they began moving into position around the Thornwood realm, and the timing would be perfect, because they would arrive exactly when the elves betrayed the humans, and both sides would be too divided to mount an effective defense. In the Crystal Gardens, Ariana and Lisa walked together under the light of both moons, and neither spoke, because sometimes silence said more than words, and their hands hung at their sides, close enough that their fingers almost touched, but never quite did. Lisa finally broke the silence and said, "I need to tell you something about what my people are planning." And Ariana said, "I need to tell you something about my council." And they both stopped walking and looked at each other, but before either could speak, the sky tore open and void energy poured through, and alarms began screaming across both the Elven Kingdom and the human settlement, because the Reavers had arrived early. They had brought more ships than anyone expected. Nethys roared and launched himself into the sky, and human weapons powered up, and Elven mages began weaving defensive spells, but everyone knew they were not ready, and the timeline they had been working with was suddenly meaningless. Ariana grabbed Lisa's hand without thinking, and power flowed between them like it had during the meeting when Ariana had healed Lisa's wounds, and both women gasped as their different magics intertwined around them. Reality rippled, and a barrier formed that was neither purely magical nor purely technological, but something entirely new that the Void Reavers could not immediately understand or breach. The Reaver Queen's laughter stopped as her scouts reported its unexpected development, and she sent more ships forward to test the barrier, but it held, because it existed in two different spectrums simultaneously, and her forces could not adapt to both at once. Inside the barrier, Ariana and Lisa stood frozen, still holding hands, while golden light and silver circuitry patterns played across both their skins, and they looked at each other with wonder and fear. The High Council rushed forward, and Counselor Theron shouted, "This is exactly what we feared, and the Queen has been compromised. And we must activate the dimensional seal now, before she dooms us all." But the people, both elven and human, had seen what happened, and they had seen their leaders create something impossible together and save them when division would have killed them, and they did not move to support the councils. Betrayal. Kate Morrison stood with her weapon ready and said, "Commander, what are your orders?" And Lisa looked at Ariana and said, "What are our orders?" Toa acknowledged that they were in this together now, for better or worse, and Ariana squeezed Lisa's hand and felt the barrier strengthen, and she made her choice. She said, "I hereby dissolve the High Council for treason against the Crown and our sworn oaths, and I strip them of title and land and magic, and guards arrest them." But before the guards could move, the Reaver Queen made her own move and sent a concentrated beam of void energy at the barrier that made it shudder and crack, and Ariana and Lisa both screamed as feedback from the impact burned through their joined connection. Fell to their knees, but did not let go of each other, because the moment they did, the barrier would fail and everyone would die. The barrier held through the first night of the Reaver assault, but Ariana and Lisa remained locked in place, channeling power that burned through them like fire through dry wood, and neither dared to move or speak because the connection was fragile. In breaking concentration, even for a moment, might collapse everything they had built. Nethys flew constant patrols around the barrier's edge, and his scales were scorched black from void energy, and his ancient body showed wounds that would take years to heal, but he did not stop because his queen needed him, and he would die before he failed. Hercler worked frantically with both human engineers and elven mages to understand what Ariana and Lisa had created. And after 6 hours of analysis, she found something that gave her hope, and she ran to where Kate and the remaining loyal elven nobles were coordinating the defense. She said, "I think I know how to stabilize the barrier without the Queen and Commander having to maintain it constantly. But we need to separate their energies and clone the barrier signature into automated pylons that can rotate between magical and technological frequencies." Kate shook her head and said, "That would take weeks to build the pylons, and we have maybe days before the Reavers overwhelm us, or before the Queen and Commander burn out from the strain." Old elven mage named Kira stepped forward and said, "There is one power source strong enough to sustain oscillating barriers of this magnitude, but the cost would be terrible." Everyone looked at her and waited, and Kira said a dragon's life force freely given could power the pylons for the time needed to evacuate both populations. The room went silent because everyone understood what that meant. And Nethys, who had been listening from outside the command center, pushed his great head through the doorway, said, "Then we have our answer." Ariana, who was connected to Nethys, through their ancient bond, felt his decision echo through her mind, and she tried to scream no, but she could not break her connection with Lisa without dooming everyone, and tears ran down her face as she felt her oldest friend preparing to sacrifice himself. Nethys said quietly in her mind, "Do not grieve yet, little Queen, because I have lived 10,000 years and seen wonders beyond counting, and my last act will be to give you a chance at happiness with someone who makes you laugh." Again, Lisa felt Ariana's anguish through their connection, and she wanted to say something comforting, but she did not know what to say, because she barely understood the bond between dragon and elf, and she could only squeeze Ariana's hand tighter and share the pain the preparations took to days. And during that time, the Reaver assaults grew more intense, and the barrier flickered and weakened, and Ariana and Lisa both aged visibly from the strain, with Ariana's silver hair turning completely white and Lisa's cybernetic systems showing burn marks and failures. The morning of the third day, Nethys flew to the highest point above the palace, and he looked down at the kingdom he had protected for so long, and he saw elven children playing with human children in the refugee camps, and he saw soldiers from both armies sharing food and stories, and he saw hope where there had been only division. He spoke one last time to Ariana and said, "I have loved you since you were a small child who rode on my back and pretended to be a great warrior, and I have watched you grow into a queen worthy of legends, and now I watch you become something more important, which is simply happy." Ariana could not speak, but her love and gratitude flowed back through their bond, and Nethys felt it warm him as he began the transformation, and his body dissolved into pure golden energy that spread across the barrier like sunrise. Dragon's consciousness fragmented into thousands of pieces, and each piece flowed into the pylons that Claire's team had built, and his essence became the power that would keep the barrier oscillating and changing and holding back. The reversus Nethys faded. His last thought was of a small elven girl laughing as she flew through clouds on his back 300 years ago, when the world was young and full of wonder. Ariana and Lisa collapsed as the connection between them was finally broken, and the barrier now sustained by Nethys' sacrifice, and medics rushed forward to help them, but Ariana pushed them away and stumbled to her feet, looking up at the sky where golden sparks drifted like fireflies, whispered goodbye, old friend, and felt an emptiness open inside her that she knew would never fully heal. Lisa stood beside her and took her hand again, not to channel power, but simply to offer comfort, and she said, "He gave you a gift, and the best way to honor it is to use it well." The evacuation began immediately because the barrier powered by Nethys' essence would hold for 4 months, and in that time they needed to build enough ships to carry both populations through the dimensional rifts to safety. Human engineers worked around the clock building transport vessels from salvaged materials, and elven mages wove space expansion spells into cargo holds to fit more people, and Claire coordinated communication between teams who were learning to combine technologies in ways neither civilization had imagined possible. But as the weeks passed, tensions rose because the mathematics were brutal and clear, and they had ships for 60% of both populations, and even working at maximum capacity, they could not build enough transport in time. The debate nearly tore apart the fragile alliance, and human survivors argued their people had priority because they had the ships and the technology, while elven counselors countered that this was their world and humans should be grateful for any space aboard Ariana. Listened to the arguments in the council chamber and felt her heart breaking again. Because after everything they had been through, and after Nethys' sacrifice, they were still divided by fear and self-interest. Stood and slammed her hand on the table hard enough to crack the stone, and silence fell, and she said enough, and we'll decide this together, or we deserve to fall separately. Lisa pulled up evacuation models on her holographic display. Said there is one other option, and if one person stays behind, to manually reinforce the barrier for the final week. While everyone else evacuates, it would buy enough time for all ships to reach the dimensional rift Ariana. Immediately said no because she knew what Lisa was suggesting, and Lisa continued in her military voice that showed no emotion and said, I stay behind and volunteer to hold the barrier alone, and when the last ship leaves I release it, and the Reavers can have an empty world. The room erupted in arguments, but Lisa's voice cut through and said someone has to stay and better one volunteer. Then 40% of both populations chosen by lottery Ariana felt panic rising in her chest because she had just lost Nethys, and now this human woman who had become so important to her was offering to die, and she said, I am queen, and if anyone makes that sacrifice, it should be. Melissa shook her head and said, you are needed to lead your people through the rifts, and I am a military commander trained for suicide missions, and this is the logical choice. Claire interrupted and said there is a third option, and what if neither of you has to? Daishi explained rapidly that they could use Nethys' pylon network to maintain the barrier. Automatically, if they overcharged it with one massive power surge, that would burn out the pylons, but give them one full week of stable coverage. Kate said that would work. But where do we get enough power for the surge? And Claire looked uncomfortable and said, we have reality fracture bombs in our arsenal, and if we detonate them in a controlled sequence channeled through the pylons, it would provide the energy needed. The reality fracture bombs were the same weapons humans had planned to use in the scorched earth protocol, and using them this way meant they could never threaten the elves again, and it was a gesture of trust that could not be taken back. Lisa made her decision and said, do it, and use every bomb we have, and Kate nodded and began issuing orders. Ariana watched this and realized that Lisa had just given up her peoples, an ultimate weapon to save both civilizations, and she felt something shift in her chest, and she walked across the council chamber and took Lisa's hand in front of everyone. She said, you have sacrificed your world and your weapon, and your dragon died. For us, and I will not let you face the end alone. Lisa's cybernetic eyes flickered with silver light that was residual elven magic from their connection, and she said, I am not good at this, and I do not know poetry or courtly gestures, but I know that I would rather spend 1 week with you than 70 years with anyone else. Council chamber went completely silent because everyone understood what they were witnessing, and Ariana smiled through her tears and said, then we will spend that week together and face whatever comes. The final evacuation began, and both armies worked as one to load civilians onto ships, and human children held hands with elven children as they boarded, and no one asked which species they belonged to, because they were all just people trying to survive. Ariana and Lisa stood on the palace tower watching the ships launch one by one, and the barrier above them pulsed with golden light from Nethys' essence mixed with the silver glow of reality fracture. Energy. Lisa said quietly, I never thought I would find this again after Earth died, and I thought I had used up all my capacity for hope. Ariana leaned against her and said, I never thought I would find it at all after 300 years of loneliness and duty. The last ship prepared for launch, and Claire stood at the ramp looking back at the planet, and she had the refugee fleet sailed through space toward the dimensional rifts and in the command ship. Ariana and Lisa stood together, looking at star charts that showed their route, and behind them, the Thornwood realm grew smaller until it was just another point of light among billions. Ariana felt the absence of Nethys like a wound that would never fully close, and sometimes she reached out through their old bond before remembering he was gone, and each time the emptiness hit her, fresh and sharp. Lisa noticed these moments, and she would take Ariana's hand or put an arm around her shoulders and say nothing, because sometimes silence was better than words, and grief needed space to breathe. Fleet consisted of 200 ships carrying 6 million souls split almost evenly between humans and elves, and every vessel was overcrowded and running on emergency power and rationed supplies. But everyone was alive and together, and that was more than either civilization had dared hope for. Weeks ago, Claire moved between ships using shuttlecraft, and she interviewed people from both species, asking them to share their stories, and she was building an oral history of the evacuation and the alliance and the sacrifice. Spoke with an elven mother named Kira, who held a human baby while the child's mother slept. And Kira said, "We thought we were so different, but grief and hope taste the same in any language." She spoke with a human engineer named Tom, who worked alongside an elven mage to repair a damaged engine, and he said, "Back on Earth, I never believed in magic, but now I have seen it save my daughter's life, and I will never doubt again." The stories Claire collected painted a picture of two civilizations. To see each other not as alien or threatening, but simply as people trying to survive in a universe that was vast and often. Krulin, the command ship Ariana, struggled with the reality of her new lifespan, and the merging of energies with Lisa had shortened her elven years to match human ones, and she had perhaps 70 years remaining. Instead of the 3,000 she had expected. Some nights this felt like losing everything, and other nights it felt like being freed from a burden she had carried too long, and Lisa would find her staring out viewports at the stars and ask what she was thinking. Ariana would say, "I spent 300 years watching everyone. I cared about age and die while I remained unchanged, and it made me afraid to love anything except duty and Nethys, but now I will age with you and die with you, and somehow that feels like a gift instead of a curse." Lisa's cybernetic system still showed patterns of silver light from the elven magic that had merged with her technology, and sometimes her implants would malfunction in ways that created beautiful displays of light across her skin. And Ariana thought it was like watching stars being born. They began planning for the future beyond just survival, and they talked about building a new settlement in the dimensional rifts where both species could live together and share their knowledge and create something that had never existed before. But 4 weeks into the journey, sensors detected something following them, and it was a Reaver scout ship that had somehow tracked them through multiple dimensional jumps, and it was sending location data back to the main swarm. Kate immediately ordered evasive maneuvers, but the scout was fast and heavily shielded, and conventional weapons barely scratched it, and if it kept transmitting, the entire Reaver fleet would find them before they reached the safety of the rifts. Ariana studied the scout's pattern and said, "It is using void energy to track the residual signature from our barrier, and as long as that energy remains in our ships, they can follow us anywhere." Lisa understood immediately. Said, "We need to purge the residual energy, but that would mean removing the modifications we made to our engines and shields, and without those modifications, half the fleet would not survive the dimensional rifts." They faced an impossible choice, and they could purge the energy and lose half their people in the rifts, or keep it and lead the Reavers directly to them and lose everyone. Claire entered the command center with an idea and said, "What if we do not purge all the energy, but concentrate it in one ship and send that ship in a different direction? To draw the scout awake," said that ship, "would need someone to pilot it, and whoever does that job would be leading the Reavers away, but also leading them to wherever the pilot goes. And that person would die." A long silence filled the command center as everyone processed this, and Lisa started to speak, but Ariana cut her off and said, "I will do it." Lisa said, "Absolutely not," and Ariana replied, "I am the one the energy is most concentrated in because of my bond with the barrier. And I am the logical choice," they argued, while the scout ship drew closer and time ran out, and finally Lisa grabbed Ariana's shoulders and said, "I have lost one world, and I will not lose you." To Ariana touched Lisa's face gently and said, "You taught me that sometimes one person's sacrifice saves everyone. Elsa and Nethys taught me that love means letting go when you must, and I am finally understanding what both of you meant." But before either could act, Kate said, "There is another option, and we modify the scout's tracking signature to think the energy is dispersed across the entire fleet when it is actually concentrated in our shielded vessels, and the scout will report back that we are not worth pursuing him." Elven mage named Brennan, who had been working with Kate, said, "I can create an illusion that will fool their sensors, but I need to be close enough to touch the scout ship, and that means spacewalking without protection for the last 100-meter skate." And Brennan looked at each other and some unspoken understanding passed between them and Kate. Said, "We do this together, and if it fails, at least the fleet has a chance." They prepared quickly and put on environmental suits and loaded into a small shuttle, and Ariana tried to order them to stop, but Kate said with respect, "Your Majesty, this is a military operation, and Commander Hart has approved." Lisa nodded and said, "They are right, and this gives us the best chance, and I trust them to get it done." The shuttle launched, and everyone in the fleet watched through external cameras as it approached the Reaver Scout, and Kate piloted with precision born from years of combat flying, and Brennan prepared the illusion spell in his mind. At 100 meters from the Scout, they depressurized the shuttle and opened the airlock. And Brennan stepped out into vacuum, with only his suit protecting him, and his hands began glowing with magical energy. Flew toward the Scout using small maneuvering thrusters, and behind him, Kate provided covering fire to distract the Scouts. Defensive systems and energy blasts lit up the darkness like fireworks. Brennan reached the Scout's hull and placed both hands against the metal, and his magic poured into the ship's sensors, rewriting how they perceived reality, and the Scout's transmission changed, showing the refugee fleet as scattered debris instead of viable targets, but the effort was too much, and Brennan's suit began failing, and Kate saw this, and she made a choice, and she flew out to him and grabbed him and used her own suit's emergency oxygen to keep him alive. They made it back to the shuttle with seconds to spare, and the Scout ship turned away, convinced there was nothing worth reporting, and it jumped back into void space to find other Protha fleets celebrated, and Kate and Brennan were brought to medical, where they recovered slowly, and Ariana visited them and said, "You saved us all, and I will not forget this." Kate smiled weakly and said, "Just doing our job, ma'am, and besides, Brennan did the hard part, and I just flew the shuttle." Brennan laughed and said, "She is lying, because she gave me her oxygen and nearly died, and I owe her my life." Ariana saw the way they looked at each other, and she recognized it, because it was the same way she looked at Lisa. And she thought maybe love was the thing that would bind these two civilizations together, more than any treaty or alliance. That night, Ariana found Lisa on the observation deck, and they stood together watching stars stream past, and Lisa said, "I was terrified today because I thought you were going to volunteer for the suicide mission." Ariana said, "I was terrified because I thought you would volunteer first and we would fight about who gets to die heroically." They both laughed, and it was slightly hysterical laughter born from stress and relief and too many close calls, but it was also genuine. And Lisa said, "We are really bad at this whole staying alive thing." Ariana kissed her and said, "Then we will have to get better, because I have 70 years with you, and I intend to use every single one of them." The fleet sailed on, and the dimensional rifts grew closer, and behind them, the Reaver Scout reported back to its queen that the prey had dispersed and was not worth pursuing. And the Reaver Queen accepted this report because she had other targets, and the galaxy was vast. In the command ship, two leaders held each other and planned for a future that neither had dared imagine, and around them, two civilizations slowly became one people, united by survival and sacrifice and hope. The refugee fleet reached the dimensional rifts 6 weeks after leaving the Thornwood realm, and the rifts were tears in space itself, where normal physics did not apply, and time moved differently, and the Void Reavers could not follow, because their biology required stable dimensions to survive. Ariana stood on the bridge of the command ship, watching the rifts approach. And they looked like wounds in the fabric of reality, glowing with colors that had no names, and she felt both hope and sadness. Because this would be home now, and there was no going. Kalisa worked with her command staff, coordinating the fleet's entry into the rifts. And each ship had to pass through at exactly the right angle and speed, or risk being torn apart by dimensional shear, and the margin for error was almost nothing. Claire had spent weeks interviewing people, and now she presented her findings to both leaders, and she said, "I have heard hundreds of stories, and one theme emerges over and over, which is that people from both civilizations no longer see themselves as purely elven or purely human, but as something new." She showed recordings of mixed families where elven parents raised human children and human parents raised elven children, and she showed engineers and mages working together so seamlessly. They finished each other's sentences, and she showed soldiers who could not remember which species they had been fighting for at the start. Ariana watched these recordings and tears ran down her face because this was what Nethys died for, and what she and Lisa had risked everything to create, and it was more beautiful than she had. Imagine the first ships entered the rifts and emerged into a pocket dimension that was stable enough for settlement. And scouts reported finding a region with breathable atmosphere and liquid water and land that could be cultivated, and it was not perfect, but it was. Enough over. The next 3 days, the entire fleet passed through the rifts, and they established a perimeter and began unloading supplies and building temporary shelters, and both civilizations worked together, because there was no longer any division between us and the Mariana and Lisa. Stood together on the surface of the new world and looked up at a sky that showed stars they had never seen before, and Ariana said, "Do you think we can make this work, Lisa?" Took her hand and said, "We have survived death worlds and void reavers in our own people's divisions, and if we can survive all that, then building a civilization should be easy." By comparison, they both laughed because nothing about this would be easy, but they would face it. Together, the settlement grew quickly, and within 2 months they had established a central city that combined elven architecture with human engineering, and the buildings were both beautiful and functional, with spires that reached toward the alien sky and foundations that could withstand dimensional storms. Claire opened a library where she stored all the recordings and histories she had collected, and she invited both species to add their stories, and the library became a place where people came to remember where they had been and imagine where they might go. Kate and Brennan became leaders of the combined military force that protected the settlement, and they trained soldiers from both species to work together, and they developed new fighting techniques that merged elven magic with human technology and created something more effective than either alone. Ariana struggled with her new mortality, and some days she woke up feeling her body aging in ways it never had before, and she would panic until Lisa reminded her that this was normal and natural, and they would age together. Lisa struggled with the silver light in her cybernetic systems that sometimes made her implants behave unpredictably, and Ariana would use her remaining magic to stabilize the systems, and they learned to work together even in small, daily tasks. 6 months after settling in the rifts, they held a ceremony to honor those who had died, and especially to remember Nethys, whose sacrifice had made everything possible, and Ariana spoke about her dragon companion, and her voice broke several times, but she finished. "Because he deserved to be remembered," she said. "Nethys lived 10,000 years, and he saw empires rise and fall, and he could have lived 10,000 more, but he chose to give his life so that we could have a future, and I will spend my remaining years trying to be worthy of that gift." The entire settlement observed a moment of silence, and then people began sharing their own stories of loss and sacrifice, and the ceremony lasted through the night and into the next day as grief became shared. Instead of individual, Lisa found Ariana afterward sitting alone in their quarters looking at a small crystal that Nethys had given her centuries ago, and Lisa sat beside her and said, "Tell me about him when you were young." Ariana smiled and said, "He was enormous and terrifying and gentle, and when I was a child, I used to ride on his back and pretend to be a great warrior, and he would fly through clouds and roar, just to make me laugh, and he never once made me feel small even though I was tiny compared to him." She talked for hours, sharing memories, and Lisa listened and asked questions, and slowly, Ariana's grief became something she could carry instead of something that crushed Hera. Year passed, and the settlement stabilized, and they named it New Haven because it was a haven for both species, and the name was simple but meaningful. The combined council of elves and humans met regularly to make decisions, and Ariana and Lisa shared leadership, and they discovered that their different perspectives made them better leaders because Ariana brought wisdom from 3 centuries of experience, and Lisa, it brought tactical thinking from battles across 17 worlds. Children born in New Haven grew up speaking both languages and learning both magic and technology, and they did not understand why their parents sometimes talked about the old divisions, because to them there had only ever been one people. Claire documented everything, and her library became the heart of the settlement. and people came there to learn history and share stories and imagine the future. And Brennan got married in a ceremony that blended elven and human traditions, and half the settlement attended, and Ariana officiated because she was still queen. Even if her kingdom was now very different. Tat. The wedding, Lisa whispered to Ariana. Do you ever regret choosing this path? And Ariana said, never, because I was lonely for 300 years, and now I am loved, and that is worth any sacrifice. Years after settling, New Haven's sensors detected something approaching through the dimensional rifts, and everyone prepared for another Rever attack, but what emerged was different, and it was a ship from another refugee civilization fleeing the reversed ship contained survivors from a species called the Meridians, who were crystalline beings that communicated through light, sound, and they were desperate and dying and asking for help. Ariana and Lisa welcomed them without hesitation, and New Haven expanded to accommodate the Meridians and the settlement's engineers and mages worked with Meridian scientists to create habitats that met their unique needs. The Meridians brought their own knowledge and technology, and they taught the settlers about dimensional navigation and energy manipulation, and in return, they learned about magic and human engineering, and the cross-pollination of ideas created innovations. None of the species had achieved alone. More refugee ships arrived over the following years, and New Haven became a beacon for civilizations fleeing the void. Reavers and each new species added their knowledge and culture to the growing Settlement 5. Years after the founding, Ariana looked at what they had built, and she saw a city of impossible beauty, where buildings of crystal and steel and living wood reached toward stars that shone in colors. She was still learning to name. She saw children of 4 different species playing together in parks that combined gardens from multiple worlds, and she saw scientists and mages and engineers collaborating on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Lisa found her on the observation tower and said, "We did good work." Ariana took her hand, and their fingers intertwined in the silver light in. Lisa's implants flickered in rhythm with the golden glow of Ariana's remaining magic, and she said, "We did it together," and that made all the difference. They stood together watching their city, and behind them, the dimensional rifts shimmered with colors that had no names, and somewhere in the distance, the Void Reavers hunted other prey, but New Haven was safe and growing and becoming something unprecedented. Ariana thought about the poem she had shared with Lisa years ago and the question it asked, and she finally had her answer. How could I be your wife when I am made of starlight in eternity, and you are made of metal and desperation? The answer was simple, and she could be Lisa's wife. Because love did not require them to be the same, but only to choose each other over and over again, through whatever challenges came. She said this to Lisa, who smiled, and said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said, and I have no idea how to top it." Ariana laughed and said, "You do not need to top it, because you already showed me through your actions, and that is worth more than any words." They kissed while the alien stars wheeled overhead, and below them New Haven hummed with life and activity and hope in the library. Claire added the final entry to her history, and she wrote that 2 leaders from different species had chosen trust over fear and love over division, and their choice had saved 6 million souls and created something new in the galaxy.